Hey guys, so welcome back for part two of the reading of Boatland by Robert Brent. Uh, I am gonna laugh because I had to send the last bill out yesterday, so I just went with the next bill that came in, which is my light bill. So for now, that's gonna be our book cover. Um, I figure today we'll just read a little bit more, two more chapters. That sounds okay for everybody. Um, if it's about 15 more pages. But I brought back the Golden Girls mug, and I am drinking green tea. So we'll go ahead and get started. Chapter 2. The week went fast. Before Crunch knew it, he had said goodbye to everyone but his backpack, put his backpack on, and started off towards Edgar's house. The one thing Crunch couldn't figure out was why he felt so bad. For his whole life, he'd planned this trip. He should have, yeah, sorry. For his whole life, he planned this trip. He should be overjoyed with excitement, but instead, he just kept thinking about his mother's watery eyes as she hugged and kissed him goodbye. While walking through town, five of the town guards started to run down the street. Their title was their title was the Cart Town Guards, but everyone knew they worked for the mayor. Both the mayor and his henchmen were disliked. Often people that spoke up against the mayor or his men were never seen again. As the guards ran down the street, they knocked down people, mostly the old and the young, as they went. The lead guard started to veer towards Crunch, but then suddenly changed his course as he looked up to see the large 6'6" frame of the frowning farm boy. All of them ran by Crunch, but as the last guard ran past, Crunch shifted his weight and leaned in with his shoulder. His shoulder hit squarely in squarely with the unsuspecting guard's shoulder. This action sent the guard spinning, and his excuse me, and he fell face first in a mud puddle. Enraged, the guard jumped up and grabbed for for the hilt of his sword. Before it was halfway out of his sheath, he felt a cold tip of Crunch's sword against his throat. The guard could not believe someone would actually knock him over, let alone draw a weapon. Slowly, Crunch withdrew his sword from the guard's neck, but held it ready to fight. The mean guard looked up nervously at the large opponent. The guard saw none of his fellow guards were in sight, so the fight would be one-on-one. Ta-da! Be today be your last yeah, today be your lucky day, boy, for I will let you live. Sorry, shouted the nervous guard for all to hear. The mayor was no mo the mayor has no mo potent yeah. The mayor has more important business for me today to take care of other than the likes of you. Sorry. Like I said, I am not pre-reading. I am just like jumping right into it. I apologize, like very much so. He knew a lot of people were watching and he had to make a show of force. At this, Crunch took a step towards the guard and raised his sword. The guard, seeing death in Crunch's eyes, turned and fled down the street. A trail of mud furious guard marked the furious guard's path. Cheers went up in all directions before he knew it. People were patting him on the back and shaking his hand. In actuality, it just seemed like a dream to him. Now that he woke up, he couldn't believe he had done such a foolish thing. Unknown to people around him, Crunch started to tremble and a little from a withdrawal of adrenaline, the rest from being afraid. Mumbling to himself, Crunch said, I have to get out of town sooner than I thought. The town people, not knowing that he had already going to leave this day, started to nod in agreement with him. A few even backed off, not wanting to be next to him if, by chance, the guards came back. Just as he started down the street at a faster pace, the town baker ran up beside Crunch and handed him a basket of bread. I always wanted to do that, one of the guards, the little man squeaked. This started a trend. Most townfolk wanted to hurt the guards. Before Crunch knew it, he was surrounded by people trying to give him something for his trip. By the time he reached Edgar's house, his hands were overflowing with stuff. He had enough food to last most people a month, plus a large blanket, a compass, a hatchet for wood, and three well-balanced throwing daggers. As Crunch approached Edgar's house, actually, house was a kind of word for it, since it was really just a rundown shack. He could hear the yells of Edgar's father. The man was a fat, smelly, old drunk that never did an honest day's work. Just as Crunch walked up to the entrance, Edgar emerged with his head hanging down, his face hidden in shadows. Well, are you about ready to see the wide, the wild world, and live life to its fullest, Edgar? Crunch joyfully said as Edgar led him to the back of the house towards the shed. Sure, Edgar whis sorry. Edgar whispered, his head still hanging down. I see you have a backpack on. We're all set to see the world, Crunch said, knowing something was wrong, but not knowing what. Edgar did not reply as they reached the shed. Crunch then figured out what must be bothering Edgar. He was unable to get everything on the list he gave to Edgar to gather a week earlier. Hey, little friend, don't worry about that stuff. I asked you to get, uh, I asked you to get, I have plenty of food for us, and we'll be fine. About that time, he noticed that Edgar still wasn't looking up. It's okay. What's bothering you? Why don't you look at me? Edgar looked up at Crunch, and what Crunch thought were shadows on Edgar's face were actually black and blue marks. The whole left side of Edgar's face was swollen and looked like a purple plum. What happened to you, Edgar? This is how my father said goodbye, mumbled Edgar, his eyes looking tired and somewhat glassy, like a man who had seen the world many times over. Crunch's anger boiled over with rage that made him want to scream to the heavens and ask why parents are so stupid, and all the time Crunch was protecting Edgar from the rest of the world, he never once thought about protecting Edgar from his parents. What of your what of your mother? Didn't she try to stop your father? Asked Crunch. Edgar's face shone in pain that went much further than the blows he had received. In almost a whisper, Edgar replied, No. She held me down, and I couldn't get away. Crunch's heart shivered up with sorry, shivered up when he had heard this. He could not fathom being raised by parents that didn't love him. Let's see they would like when how they would like some of their own punishment, Crunch growled in an unsheathing his sword. Just as he turned to walk back to the house, a hand grabbed him by the shoulder and spun him around. No, Egger said in a voice of command. Crunch was caught by surprise, not only by the strength of Egger turning him around, or how his voice commanded attention, but by the man standing in front of him. No longer was Egger the boy in front of him, but Egger was Egger, the man staring straight into his eyes without blinking. What's done is done. There is nothing you could do to people like that they wouldn't have done to themselves, said Egger. Crunch listened to Egger's words. He wouldn't he couldn't understand them. Uh, but something uh, but somehow he believed Egger knew what he was trying to talk about, or what he was talking about. Have it your way was all Crunch was able to say. He put his sword away and looked back at Edgar. No longer was an Edgar the man. Edgar the boy once again stood in front of him, trying to grin but wincing in pain. Edgar swung the shed door open. He couldn't get everything I couldn't get everything you asked for, but I did get most of it. Crunch just stood in amazement with his mouth hanging open. In front of them stood two horses with saddles and backpacks already loaded. This, or then he noticed the mule tied behind the large horse. It too was packed to the brim with baggage. How on earth did you get all this stuff? Well, I had to trade certain books of mine for some of it. Then I did Leon's tax book and showed him how to save money by di- diversifying his blacksmith profits into a nonprofit business. He was so overjoyed with his plan that he gave me two older horses. Widow Eileen paid me for clearing out her attic and let me keep anything I wanted. Then I traded old man Zach two of Widow Ellen's older bloomers for two saddles. There were a lot of winter clothes from her late husband. As Edgar rumbled on and on, good lord. As Edgar rambled on and on, Crunch was barely paying attention. He was looking at all of the supplies on the horses. This was more than he could ever hope for. If Crunch was had known how resourceful Edgar was, he would have asked for a chest of gold and a parade to see them off. Happily, Crunch loaded his supplies on his horse and mounted it. His large horse was used to carrying a heavy weight, yet still groaned loudly under Crunch's weight. Excuse me, you old nag, Crunch said sternly into its ear of the Meanwhile, Egger was still telling how he gathered his supplies. Egger, let's get a move on while the day is still young, Crunch said. Egger didn't even hear Crunch's words. Crunch smiled to himself, then grabbed the reins of Egger's horse and started off. At the slow walk, Egger didn't even notice. When Egger finally finished his explanations, he looked up and noticed that Crunch was nowhere to be in sight. Well, I'll be darned, Edgar said, scratching his head. Quickly, Edgar noticed the tracks of the horse and the mule and what path determined what path Crunch had taken out of the town. As Edgar raced away from his past, his mind peeled and with him and all excitement his adventure was going to lead him. Around the final house of the at the edge of town, Edgar ran, his head still working on all the future plans so fast he didn't even look where he was going. Bam! Edgar smacked into something hairy, large, and unmovable. Looking up, he saw he had ran into the rear end of his horse. Crunch had stopped the horse, waiting for Edgar, but now Crunch could hardly sit on his horse because he was laughing so hard. Edgar, I hope you never change, for I truly love to laugh, Crunch said after he stopped laughing. Edgar wiped himself off, smiled, and mounted his horse. Without a word, the duo and set off to find their fame and fortune. Chapter 3. The rest of the first day was pretty uneventful. Edgar and Crunch shared dreams of adventure, fame, and fortune. Heading into the southeast direction, they left the only life they had ever known. Before sunset approached, the duo made camp in a nice little field. They could have pressed on to the next little town before the moon rose, but both were ready to get off of the horse. No, no one ever told them they could get blisters on places they had them from riding all day. After the camp was set up and they fed the horses and themselves, they turned in for the night. As both of them lay in their stomachs in their blankets, gazing into the fire, one thing crept across their minds. How come they didn't bring any ointment? Most of the night was pretty boring. That is, until both Edgar and Crunch were awakened. Crash! Something had ripped through the brush towards them at a fast pace. Crush jumped up first, grabbing his sleeth, sleeth sword and yanked it out so hard he couldn't hang on to it. The sword went sailing through into the darkness. Edgar, still thinking he was dreaming, tried to figure out why there was so much noise in his room. Crunch or crash. The noise came again, but this time much closer. Edgar finally realized where the was, jumped out of his blanket, tripped, yeah, tripped while reaching for his pants, and stumbled headfirst into the intruder. The fire was nothing more than a glowing embers. Crunch could barely make out Edgar's stumbling form. Crunch was standing in his sleepwear with an empty sword sheath, facing some unknown monster. Crunch started to wonder if marrying a fat woman was really so bad. Suddenly, Bertha's face appeared to Crunch, and he knew he would rather fight any monster. In the blur of motion, Crunch reached down, grabbed his blanket, and threw the blanket into the air where yeah, threw the blanket into the air where he'd just heard the thump. In three large strides, Crunch was literally on top of them. Edgar had knocked down the intruder when he stumbled into him, and before either of them could react, the blanket covered them. Crunch fell right on top of them both. All three of them were struggling. Somehow, Edgar had pushed out of the commotion, knowing that he was no use enough as a fighter. He darted to the fire, threw some threw some dry grass and twigs, and blew onto the coals. With all his might, In a split second, the grass caught fire and the large flames leaped up. There was There in the light, Egger saw Crunch constricting the life out of someone. With a close look at the person, Egger yelled out, "Stop, Crunch! You're killing him!" Crunch shot Egger look with that's shot Egger a look that said, "Duh, Crunch." Yeah, sorry. Egger shot Yeah. Crunch shot Egger a look that said, "Duh." Crunch then noticed that the back of the intruder's head looked like Dash. Slowly, he loosened his grip, and Dash sank to the ground. Both of them looked down at their unconscious friend. He was breathing all right, but at a closer look, something looked out of place. His clothes were ripped to shreds. His face was pale but covered with dried blood. Dash's shirt was still wet on the left side with from fresh blood. Edgar knelt down and found the wetness was from a nasty cut on Dash's left side. While Edgar ran to the saddle to get some medicine and bandages, Crunch placed Dash down by the fire and took his shirt off. Both Edgar and Crunch undressed Dash and bandaged him up as best as they knew how. When Edgar removed Dash's shoes, he felt very sick. The blood poured out of each shoe as they were taken off. The entire bottom of Dash's foot was covered in blisters that had popped and bled. Again, they treated his feet the best that they knew how. Not a word was spoken during the whole time they worked, nor did they speak as they watched their friend until morning. Each was consumed by thoughts of what could have happened had and wondered if Dash would even wake up again. As Dash woke in the late morning, he looked at his two friends and smiled. For the first time since the encounter, Crunch and Egger relaxed with audible sighs. The morning was nice for this time of year. The sky was dark blue with just a few clouds. So tell us, Dash, how was how we became graced with your presence? Crunch said with a smile on his face. Weren't there enough girls in town for you? One too many, Dash mumbled to himself. In a royal manner, he declared, If I felt it was unjust to grace my friends with the presence for so many years and then just cut them off so abruptly. I figured it would be horrible injustice to let my friends face the unknown while mentally and psychological while mental hold on. I figured it would be a horrible injustice to let my friends face the unknown while mentally a psychological mess. Furthermore, I felt it was unfair to limit my charm and beauty to a small percentage of the female population. Both Edgar and Crush looked at each other and started to yawn on purpose. Then, please explain your sad state. Surely one of your talents and charms could have found a mount to ride. Crunch kept pressing, knowing he could get the correct answer out of Dash sooner or later. Well, you see, if uh, it was such a nice day, I felt it would be a shame to rush by such gorgeous sights on a smelly old horse. A nice brisk walk is much nicer way to travel, Dash said with a smile. Well, how do you explain this? Edgar said, while hitting the bottom of his feet with a stick. Ouch! Yelled Dash. Okay, I'll tell you, but keep that stick away from me. Both Edgar and Crush enjoyed this. It was always it wasn't very often that they could get Dash to tell the truth without a long drawn out story. Well, it was like this. I was minding my own business and I saw this huge dragon come out from the woods. I knew I had to do something fast. Crunch grabbed the stick out of Edgar's hand and started to move towards Dash's feet. Okay, Crunch, I'll tell you, but put that stick down, Dash shouted with the pain in his voice. The mayor's daughter found out that I had been seeing other girls and told Daddy I raped her. He felt he then sent the guards after me to kill me. I was able to fight my way out of town, but one muddy guard stabbed me in the side. Since then, I've been running. They chased me with the dogs, so I had to run deep into the thicket to elude them. I never stopped running until I ran into your camp. I didn't mean to bring trouble down on my friends, but I had nowhere else to turn. Dash turned out into the darkness and his fear turned out to the darkness of his fears. Even now, I can still hear the barking and the vicious dogs getting closer and closer. No matter how fast I ran, they just kept gaining on me. Both Crunch and Egger looked at each other, knowing that their friend had been through hell and knowing they had to get moving. Maybe it was a mistake to come here, Dash said. With my feet all messed up, not having a horse to ride, you won't be able to move very fast, and that's dangerous for us all. You can ride my horse, Crunch and Egger said in unison. Both Egger and Crunch jumped at the opportunity to walk for a while and let Dash ride their horse. Each had several blisters in their both had several blisters of their own that needed some time and tender care. After breaking camp, the trio headed off with Dash hiding or riding and both Egger and Crunch walking. Each of them had visions of their future, but somehow everything wasn't as bright and shiny as the day before. The gloom settled over them, and each seemed nervous and on edge. Despite two of them walking, the trio had very good time. By noon, they arrived at the town of Bragg, the nearest town to Carttown. After noticing Dash growing concerned, they decided it would be best to continue on past town instead of stopping. Little did they know that this decision saved them their lives. For inside the town's pub sat 9 cart town guards waiting for their prey. Several hours after passing Bragg, the tension faded from the traveling group. Soon Dash was humming a tune that he would later turn into a love song. Crunch was sneaking some of his food ration while Egger was trying to determine how many legs uh, how many legs of a fly could form an acute angle at the same time. Crunch started to think out loud. Well, I hate to admit it, but I think we might have bitten off a little more than we could chew. Ash stopped humming and listened to Crunch. So what do you mean by that? Inquired. Well, last night you stumbled into camp and we just about killed ourselves in the commotion. What would have happened to us if a real intruder would have come after us? Yes, I see what you mean. If I had been a killer, even a blind one, I could have easily killed you all, Dash replied with a frown on his face. I suppose I better devise a plan for us to execute for the future, Egger said. Both Dash and Crunch raised an eyebrow at Edgar's words. Is that so? Exclaimed Dash. So who appointed you to do all the thinking? Can you think of anyone smarter that could come up with a better plan? Edgar asked Edgar. But even as he spoke those words, his mind was already reeling with sorry. His his mind was already reeling with tactical plans and for the three men's party. No, you're the smartest one of us, Dash said, knowing that Edgar was just stating the truth and not trying to brag. But I'm the fastest and best looking. That should be taken into account. And I'm the strongest, Crunch piped in, piped in, not wanting to be left out. I'm also the hungriest one. When are we going to eat? The sun was just starting to set, and only about 2 hours of sunlight were left. I believe we need more experience on the road and with weapons. So I propose for an hour before sunset we will set up camp and secure the area. After this is done, both of you will practice with your weapons, said Edgar. What about you? What will you be doing? Asked Dash. I'll be tending to the horses, prepping for the meals, and cleaning up after you two, Edgar explained. Sounds good to me, Crunch said, knowing that if he had to cook the meal, they would all be losing weight. I also accept this arrangement, agreed Dash, knowing that he hated to groom horses and clean. As the trio settled down for the evening, Edgar instructed both of his companions how to practice. The first plan was to study their surroundings and go over in their minds different defenses and attacks. Edgar asked how they would respond to an attack from the south. Dash and Crunch described how they would respond, and then they improvised an idea. This continued until they all knew what to do in any attack. Next, Edgar unpacked two old swords, one light and one heavy. Both Dash and Crunch received them with frowns. These hunks of metal don't even deserve to be called weapons, exclaimed Dash as he grabbed his small one. Maybe not, but they will serve their purpose. And besides, Mrs. Buttleby was throwing them out, said Edgar with a smile. And just what is their purpose? Oh, great one. Yeah. And just what is their purpose? Oh, great one, exclaimed Crunch. There is a This is your priority, Dash. You must learn to block and repel the broadsword with your two-handed sword. Sorry, guys. At this point, Dash just stared at Edgar with his mouth open. You have to be kidding me. No one could do that with this light rapier, whined Dash. Dash, I guess you will your work cut out for you. But this will be a breeze for me, spoke Crunch with a broad smile on his face. Don't be so quick on your smile, Crunch. I haven't told you what your priority is, exclaimed Edgar. Crunch's smile faded. Your priority is to be able to fence a small sword or a reaper. That includes parry or dodging, Edgar said. Oh, get real, you little egghead. There is no way that could be done, pouted Crunch. These hunks of metal, as you call them, are dull for a reason. If they hit a person, They will only leave a bruise, nothing more, Edgar demonstrated. Now pair up and give it a try as soon as I say go. Ready? Go. Both men faced each other with weapons ready, but neither smiled. As soon as Edgar gave the signal, both men went at it. With incredible speed, Dash was able to poke Crunch 5 times in his ribs before Crunch had drawn back his weapon. Then Crunch's heavy sword became crush, came crashing down in a mighty swing, swiping the rapier off out of Dash's hands like a twig from a river. I told you it wouldn't. Yeah, I told you it couldn't be done, complained Dash with his rub. Yeah, with his rub. Sorry, complained Dash as he rubbed his hands. I I have to agree with Dash. There's no way to defend yourself. Only the attacker has the advantage, commented Crunch as he rubbed his rubbed and poked his ribs. I see the problem uh, with both of you being defense, commented Ager with a matter-of-fact voice. Dash, you're trying to block a heavy sword with the middle of the sword. Use the hilt area. This will give you a better leverage. Also, move forward to block the blows. Stop the swinging before you gain momentum. Edgar turned towards Crunch without pausing. Crunch, move your sword at the hilt. Twist, twist and turn it to block and the rapier, but only swing your heavy sword for the attack, not for the defense. Stunned, both men looked at Edgar and then at each other. Now, since both of you can't be the defense, take turns one at a time, with one being the attack and the other the defense, said Edgar. Dash, you go first. Concentrate on what I said. Think of what you have to do before you do it. Get ready? Now. Go. Crunch drew back his weapon and Dash had to control his urge to lunge forward and stab at his opponent. Instead, he lunged forward and blocked and the downward stroke of the heavier sword. He could not completely stop the swing of the blade, but he slowed it down enough so that he could not be a threat. Then Crunch reversed the direction of the heavy sword and caught Dash off balance. Dash landed on his rear with a large thump to avoid the heavy sword. See, I told you. This is too hard to accomplish, stated Dash as he stood up. If it was easy, there would be no need to practice, explained Edgar, sounding like an old wise man. Remember, you still have 45 minutes left to practice today. Both Dash and Crunch stared in amusement at Edgar turning and walking towards the camp, both men wondering when Edgar had changed into a master of warfare, no longer the bumbling fool that had been their friend. At that moment, Edgar's attention was shifted to the clouds, and he stared in wonder how the water in the clouds turned to white. Not looking where he was going, he tripped on a root and fell into a fresh pile of horse manure. Both Dash and Crunch burst into laughter. Both of them were glad to know some things hadn't changed. So I think we're gonna stop right there. Um, I I'm enjoying this. I think it's interesting. Still kind of stumbly. That's kind of just because I'm still getting used to reading aloud, like I said. But we've made a dent. I think it's we're approaching about the 10% mark for this. I'm I don't know. I like it, and I hope you guys do too. Um, yeah, just leave comments, anything you would recommend. Um, yeah, I kind of like this that I don't know what's gonna happen as I kind of read it. Um, I don't know, but I left that up to you guys. So I hope you all have a great rest of your day. And I don't know. Do you guys like that I release these at 9 o'clock? Um, that's the other thing. But I hope you all are filled with peace, love, and joy. Have a good night, guys.